Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the first TeTra paper of the year, and for that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today Ted Erho, who is a research fellow in the Faculty of Protestant Theology in Munich, and also a research fellow in the Georg Ludolf Center for Ethiopian Studies in Hamburg, where he's working within the ERC project Beyond the Influence, the Connected Histories of Ethiopic and Syria Christianity. He has worked extensively on Ge'ez literature and the manuscripts with a focus on Enochic writings and Old Testament pseudepigrapha, as well as early Christian literature. His research includes cataloging work and especially identifying and publishing new Ethiopic texts. For instance, if for the Shepherd of Hermas there are 4 known Ethiopic manuscript witnesses, Ted has identified and published the 3rd and the 4th Ethiopic witness of this text. And you can read his work on Ethiopic palimpsests in open access in the recent volume on palimpsests and related phenomena across languages and cultures, published with the Greuter. And Ted, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that kind and very generous introduction. I'm so happy to have been invited and to be here today and to be able to share a bit about a text and a project that I've been working on for around the past 4 years. And so now I'll begin, and I'd like to share my PowerPoint. Can you see that correctly? Okay.
Yes.
Months after his defeat of Licinius, Constantine, now unrivaled ruler of the Roman dominions, summoned bishops from around his empire to a council at the city of Ankara. Subsequently moved to Nicaea for logistical reasons, this council, the first with such a wide-ranging geographic spread of participants, remains best remembered today for its creed and anathematization of Arius. These, however, were not the only topics deliberated. Among the other matters taken up was the case of Melitius of Lycopolis, one for which the council seems to have prepared quite purposefully, with an official deposition of the Egyptian being conducted either before or during its proceedings. While the apparent importance of this case is suggested by the fact that the conciliar letter sent to the Egyptian church afterwards devotes more lines to this matter than to any other topic, considerably more than to Arius, incidentally, that it received such attention stands as something of a curiosity on the basis of the surviving historical record. Indeed, although Melitius appears as a major antagonist to Peter of Alexandria, recorded most prominently in the latter part of the first section of the Jubilee Book of 368, effectively a decade of silence lies between those events and the Council of Nicaea, during and after which he once again briefly forms a schismatic threat to the Alexandrian ecclesiastical hierarchy. Only the Panarion has offered any sort of ancient account of Melitius's activities during these years, but, as has long been understood, Epiphanius is hardly a reliable or trustworthy historian. In 2 separate chapters, for instance, he writes that the schismatic died before the Council of Nicaea, an assertion contradicted by the entire external body of historical evidence. Why the Nicene Assembly should have been tasked with the case of Melitius 12 years into Alexander's episcopate, rather than any of the councils held at Alexandria, Antioch, or elsewhere earlier in his reign, thus represents something of historical conundrum, especially in view of Peter's excommunication of his rival so long before. Several aspects of this conundrum, as well as Melitius's reemergence in ecclesiastical affairs in the 320s, can, I believe, be resolved through the testimony of a short, hitherto unrecorded letter of Archbishop Alexander I of Alexandria, extant in Ethiopic translation, the Epistula ad Tiberium. Although Alexander was a prolific epistolist, only 8 surviving letters or fragments thereof are attributed to him in some form, many, but not all of which, are genuine. The newest member of this corpus reads as follows. Alexander to Tiberius, my beloved brother and our fellow minister, greetings in the Lord. Now then, it is necessary and pleased us that you should know this also, that Melitius attacked the church stealthily again, vexing our brothers until the Lord was angry, and we were set in motion by his Holy Spirit. We, having investigated in a record book, found out from its contents that you were adhering to the faith in the days of the persecution, and he was seized. And we found out that he apostatized for his own sake and the sake of his children, as the living became martyrs among our whole congregation. There is clear evidence that he denied the Lord, since he therefore personally reveals himself to be a philosopher and not a Christian within the record book, while Paul the Apostle despises philosophy with his empty allure, saying, "No one took you forcibly through stolen wisdom, a thing of empty allure concerning worldly affairs and concerning man's precepts, and not pertaining to Jesus Christ." And because of this, he decided it was necessary to nominate an official whose name is Nemasinos himself, and I contended, since the Lord is with the people, contending. So I myself resisted him also in the matter of the official, in order that, above all, Melitius, having been disgraced, would be contaminated in everything. Now then, since it has become evident in every matter that he's an alien and a stranger, he is outside of the church. Take care, therefore, not to enter into communion with him, since we have contaminated him so much, and formerly they were bishops. And so from this time forward, tend the flock that I was entrusted, each one of you remaining in your own place where he has planted. And our Lord Jesus Christ will destroy him quickly through the word of his mouth on account of your continual prayer, beloved brothers, which is from my perspective a sacrifice. And our brothers salute you in your sacrifice, and I salute it, our brothers. Despite the possibly spurious accusation that Melitius apostatized during the Great Persecution, a claim that actually comports with the words of Athanasius in his Apologia Secunda, little reason exists to doubt the antiquity and overall authenticity of this letter. These two aspects are naturally intertwined. First of all, although differing in contents, some nearly exact parallels with passages in contemporaneous Egyptian ecclesiastical letters, also extant in Ethiopic translation, exist. For example, in Peter's of Alexandria's Epistula ad Alexandrinos, he temporarily excommunicates Melitius by instructing the faithful to, quote, take care, therefore, not to enter into communion with this one, end quote, more or less matching the admonition of Alexander to, quote, take care, therefore, not to enter into communion with him, end quote. Another close parallel arises with the introduction to the earlier 4th century letter of the 4 bishops to Melitius, which, like the Epistula ad Alexandrinos, is copied in full on the folio preceding Alexander's letter in its Ethiopic witness. Although textual issues beset this section of the latter, the most plausible reconstruction suggests a rendering, quote, Alexander to Tiberius, my beloved brother and our fellow minister, greetings in the Lord, end quote, one fundamentally analogous to, quote, Hesychius, Pachomius, Theodorus, and Phileus to Melitius, our beloved brother and fellow minister, greetings in the Lord, end quote. Neither of these phraseological parallels can be considered decisive, but they suggest that this new letter likely belongs to the milieu of the early 4th century Alexandrian church, especially as the antiquity of the corresponding epistles is confirmed through their presence in Latin translation in the 7th century Codex Veronensis 60. The only other reasonable option is that it comprises an ancient forgery or spurious document. Impeding such a possibility are, however, multiple historical aspects. Alexander's letter is addressed to a cleric called Tiberius, an admittedly not uncommon name in the Roman world, but one almost unattested among the Egyptian bishops. In fact, it appears in only a single context namely among the various lists enumerating the bishops from Egypt and the Thebaid who attended the Council of Nicaea in 325, where the name holder comprises one of between 13 and 15 delegates from this quarter. This inclusion within the Egyptian contingent might imply that he was among Alexander's more intimate colleagues, in which case this Tiberius would represent a natural primary recipient for a circular letter excommunicating Melitius. Since his name does not clearly appear in lists of earlier episcopal appointments, he may even have been elevated to this position by Alexander himself, a scenario that might imply a strong theological and political alignment between the two men. Unfortunately, a level of textual instability exists with respect to the location of Tiberius's diocese in the list of Nicene bishops, but it may not be coincidence that more than one of the possibilities possessed rival Melitian bishops at the time of Nicaea. If situated in any of these locales on the front lines of the schism, the historical likelihood that he might have served as a primary addressee for a circular letter devoted to the controversy would be elevated. The other figure mentioned, Nemesinos, poses a less clear-cut case, especially insofar as the precise underlying Greek name cannot be ascertained with confidence. Apart from a handful of common ones, transliterated proper nouns are notoriously prone to corruption in the Ethiopic manuscript tradition, and Nemesinos, unfortunately, does not cleanly reflect a particular name. It falls closest to Nemesinos, for which contemporary Egyptian evidence exists, but the closely related Nemesianos and Nemesion are far better represented in early 4th century documentary texts from the region. Either of these is quite plausible if a small corruption has occurred in Ethiopic towards the end of the word, and a comparable one via the addition rather than deletion of a character also raises the possibility of Nemesios. Although far rarer among the contemporary documentary materials, a presbyter of Alexandria with this name was among the signatories to Alexander's Epistula encyclica in early 325. From the Breviarium Meliti, it is clear that Melitius tried to gain a foothold among the Alexandrian clergy, counting 4 presbyters and 3 deacons among his appointees. Might he have tried to elevate the presbyter Nemesios in the same way that he may have another Alexandrian presbyter, Koluthos? Sadly, the available historical evidence is too scant to draw such a conclusion with any confidence, and the person in question may well not be this Nemesios. Despite the lack of a definitive historical attribution, the name Nemesinos in and of itself, otherwise unattested in Ethiopic, in no way impinges upon the probable historical verisimilitude of the letter. Likewise, the activities of Melitius of Lycopolis, described in Alexander's epistles, comport quite fully with the historical portrait of this individual recorded elsewhere. As alluded to previously, the claim that Melitius apostatized during the Diocletianic persecution is already known from the Apologia Secunda, where Athanasius asserts that he was convicted of offering sacrifices to idols and other crimes by a council of bishops during Peter's episcopate. Well, whether historical or scurrilous, this idea is therefore hardly without ancient precedent. Similarly, the primary action described in the letter, an attempt to undertake the nomination of an ecclesiastical official, merely replicates the activity for which he was arguably most known. The letter thus introduces little new and nothing out of character, just an additional occasion during Alexander's episcopate, when Melitius once again indulged in a behavior that the Alexandrian ecclesiastical hierarchy found odious and threatening. As such, from the late antique Greek perspective, nothing precludes the acceptance of the document as a product of Alexander, or at least his tenure as Archbishop of Alexandria. Examination of the Ethiopic transmissional context through which the letter has reached us does not alter this assessment. No evidence whatsoever exists for the creation of Ge'ez writings, spuriously assigned to patristic or other figures for nearly all of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. And even cases of accidental or deliberate reattribution of works in such a fashion are decidedly rare. Though a number of important documents on the Melitian schism are preserved in Ethiopic, most notably in the so-called Historia Episcopatus Alexandrinae, the indigenous manufacture of an additional one would remain unprecedented by all accounts and measures, requiring a scenario straining the bounds of credibility. The plausibility of the epistle having been composed in the Horn of Africa is further obviated by the paraphrase of Colossians 2:8, as the text in the letter and the Old Ethiopic version of the verse share few commonalities. A non-Ethiopic origin is thus mandated. Further evidence corroborating this notion and upholding the antiquity and authenticity of the letter emerges from the means by which it almost certainly entered and was transmitted within the Ethiopic tradition. The unique witness to this letter of Alexander of Alexandria lies in a late 14th or early 15th century Synodicon manuscript from the venerable monastery of Tanakirkos, microfilmed by the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library as project number 7597 on October 7th, 1980. In addition to the customary text found in such codices around this era, this manuscript includes several documents either unknown or less common in such synodicons, including a discourse of Pseudo-Chrysostom on the descent of the Holy Spirit, CPG 5140.5, and the first section of the Jubilee book, referred to by Alessandro Bausi and Alberto Camplani as the Historia Episcopatus Alexandriae. Save for the deliberate excision of three lengthy lists of episcopal appointees, that is their sections 18, 21, and 24, this witness, which also preserves a previously missing section covering the tenures of Heraclius and Dionysius, comports quite faithfully with the text of the exemplar, edited by Bausi, until close to the end. There, that is at section 75, without any discernible break, the letter of Alexander lies, immediately after which the text transitions to a copy of most of the first 8 sections of the canonical responses of Timothy I of Alexandria, CPG 2520. Given this positioning, its subject, and the linguistic character of the Ethiopic text, there can be little doubt that Alexander's epistle derives from a translation of a larger history covering the Alexandrian See and its struggles against the ecclesiastical opponents, namely the Jubilee Book of 368, a copy of which was dispatched to Carthage in 419. It cannot, however, have formed merely a variant part of the section ably edited by Bausi, whose final major historical point is the ascension of Alexander to the throne of St. Mark in 313. The letter likely covers events relatively close to the Council of Nicaea, and there is no reason to believe that the history, as originally composed, would have largely bypassed the critical decade in which Arius emerged as the greatest threat to Alexandrian orthodoxy. Nor is there any reason to believe that Nicaea, in its climactic anathematization of Arius, would have gone unrecorded. Moreover, as it stands, the so-called Historia Episcopatus Alexandriae terminates nonsensically for a polemical ecclesiastical history. The antagonists have the upper hand. Melitius remains at large, while Arius is growing in power. Neither has met his comeuppance. The work must consequently have included one or more additional lost books or sections, the next dealing with events under Alexander, and doubtless a third covering part of Athanasius's tenure, within which both antagonists would meet their mutual fate of denunciation and death. The Epistula ad Tiberium would then have belonged to the second book, and for uncertain reasons was grafted onto the end of the first by some scribe, editing not unlike the deliberate removal of the Episcopolis earlier in the text. If this reconstruction is correct, its antiquity and authenticity are once again largely confirmed through its integration into the larger work, as the inclusion of the Epistula ad Alexandrinos and Epistula Episcoporum ad Melitium, both long considered genuine, suggests that the 4th century historian had access to and was reliant on copies of ecclesiastical documents produced in the preceding decades. Perhaps even more significantly, such a reconstruction posits that further portions of the larger historical work were translated into Ge'ez, offering a degree of hope that they may one day emerge in the Horn of Africa, shedding new light on this tumultuous period of history. While the full course of Melitius's actions remains unclear, previously published sources allow for a few events involving him during Peter's episcopate to be established with some certainty. Via the letter of the 4 bishops, CPG 1667, there can be little doubt that he entered dioceses of his colleagues during the early years of Diocletianic persecution and made appointments of ecclesiastical officials without the permission of his colleagues or the Archbishop of Alexandria, an action for which he was admonished. Despite this rebuke, Melitius persisted in both activities, eventually leading Peter to temporarily excommunicate him in the Epistula ad Alexandrinos, CPG 1641. More than one ancient source indicates that this excommunication became formalized and lasted through the end of Peter's episcopate in 311. When the Council of Nicaea met in mid-325, Melitius and his followers were returned to communion, much to Athanasius's chagrin. Although tempting to directly link this restoration to the decision promulgated by Peter, as Athanasius himself suggests, there are now several pieces of evidence that support a different rendition of events. The letter to Tiberius implies that Alexander excommunicated Melitius personally, an action that would seemingly be unnecessary if the judgment of Peter had remained in effect. Moreover, both Alexander's direct dealings and his admonition to Tiberius not to enter into communion with Melitius suggest some level of interaction between these men that was not completely frosty up to that point. Along with a textually corrupt statement, perhaps avowing that until that point multiple Melitians were considered legitimate bishops, these passages hint at this excommunication changing the status quo of the near past. Another fragmentary letter of Alexander, CPG 2003, preserved in Syriac in the 6th century British Library additional manuscript 12156, may further attest to such a situation. Written circa 323, it is addressed to a bishop named Melitius, and although this individual cannot be definitively identified as the Lycopolian, such arguably represents the best option. The extant fragments of this, as well as a slightly antecedent Egyptian synod mentioned in Alexander's encyclical Henosomatos, CPG 2000, seem totally focused on Arius and his heresy, a situation not easy to reconcile with the idea of an ongoing, charged, and highly dangerous conflict with Melitius. Even Epiphanius, though often confused, might preserve a genuine memory that for much of Alexander's episcopate, there was fraternization and no major quarrel with the Melitians. His claim that Melitius first detected Arius's heresy and brought it to the attention of the archbishop may even merit historical consideration, as such would have provided the two with a common enemy that might have prompted them to temporarily set aside their differences and join forces against the more fundamental threat. These elements, along with the plausible interpretation of Melitius's stealthy attack as implying a preceding period of some length without such aggravations, together intimate the strong likelihood of a degree of rapprochement with the Alexandrian Church in the early 320s. Given this situation, as well as the sudden Nicene interest in the Melitian controversy, a topic of no apparent ecclesiastical concern for a number of years, The Epistula at Tiberium and the events described therein probably date to circa 324. The reemergence of this matter in close proximity to the council thus likely played the pivotal role in it being dealt with at Nicaea, which happened to be the next opportunity to formally address the situation. Thank you.
I propose that we thank our speaker, says Erho, for the stimulating paper reconstructing a 4th century context for the Ethiopic letter. It is my pleasure now to open the floor for questions. You are all warmly invited to share your questions for our speaker, either through raising your virtual hand or by writing in the chat, and we'll happily give you the floor. And perhaps to start us off, Ted, could I maybe ask you about a phrase in the letter of Alexander that you read to us in your first 2 slides? The author presents himself as working from a record book using written evidence. And I was curious about that. I wondered if you could maybe say something about the use of written records or what this might suggest.
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear on this point exactly what sort of record book it would be. I think the two options there would seem to have been governmental, so Roman records that may have by that point sort of potentially a decade after the persecutions been accessible by some church officials. The other is both Peter's letter to the Alexandrians suggests that he was going to form a council and basically depose Melitius. In the history of the Episcopate of Alexandria, curiously, there is a shift, or basically this council or proposed council doesn't actually seem to happen. Athanasius, on the other hand, sort of suggests that it did happen. But in any case, if there was some sort of ecclesiastical deposition of Melitius, that could perhaps, there would be some sort of presumably written record of what was said there, and that could be, the other sort of record book that might be referred to.
Very interesting. Thank you. So would you maybe see this as an authorizing strategy to somehow?
Yes, and also because, except for here and with Athanasius, who is placing that not in Alexander's reign, but in Peter's, these are the only 2 places where we really find any sort of claim that Melitius apostatized. And I, wonder whether this isn't just some sort of calumny to, more or less undermine Melitius. That the issue is really just that Melitius is undertaking these appointments without authorization. From the records from the Nicene Council, there's no reference to any idea that Melitius apostatized, and it doesn't show up in any other context. And yeah, so in that sense, I wonder whether it's sort of authorizing, we found this document, but it's more or less just spurious, made-up claim.
Very interesting. Thank you. The next question is asked by Alberto Camplani.
Do you hear me? Yes. Are you able to?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this great discussion of what I think it is a very important identification. I have a lot of problems and a lot of questions to put because the contents are difficult to understand from my point of view if we think that it is an authentic document and not a kind of a construction. But I think that my first question is about this is should be a translation from Greek.
Yes.
Not this is sure. So it is the kind of documents that we find also in the Historia, in the Synodos, in Bauzi Aksumite collection. And this is important. So it is a very ancient document. Besides the question of authenticity or non-authenticity of the document. The second point is the problem of apostasy. You are right in underlying that this could be a problem. Now, I only try to make two hypotheses. The first is yes, it is Alexander who is speaking about what was a kind of conviction, but not well founded, because we do not have nothing in the tradition about Melitius apostasy apart from Athanasius Apologia Secunda 59 and this new document. Yes, we could also think that he's addressing his fellow minister and is speaking bad of an ecclesiastical enemy, or it is strange because Alexander is a contemporary of Melitius, and but he could say that he was free when the Bishop of Martyrs were condemned to death, and yes, he was consecrating new bishops, etc. And so this kind of liberty, in a sense, was a self-demonstration of his being an apostate. But we could also reverse the question and think that here is an author in the 60s or the 70s of the 4th century that is creating a document against the Melitius, against the Melitians that were present in the monasteries of Egypt, in which Apologia Secunda 59 is reworked, and but it is only a doubt, and I think that you perceive that this is a very great problem. For Tiberius, I think that here we have on Tiberinus, that is one of the bishops ordered by Peter. That could be the same in the Alexander Nicene lists. So he could be Tiberinus or Tiberius. I think that also in Greek you have this kind of variation without problems. So and also there is a 2 or 1 Nemesian in the lists, so it is a very common name. And also in the authentic lists until the 5th century, you have variations in the orthography of this name. So this could be really what is strange from my last consideration is what is strange is that in what kind of a manuscript, so it is collocated between what words? I understood that it is before, it is a part of the same manuscript, so a leaf of the same manuscript of the Historia Ecclesiastica, or it is another manuscript?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, there are great questions, excuse me, but...
yeah, I'll try to address it. Thank you very much for your comments. With regard to the manuscript, so it is a Synodicon manuscript. However, more or less just before we have the material pertaining to the Nicene degrees, the Nicene canons, there is a section of older materials. This begins with a more or less the history of the Episcopate of Alexandria. At the very end, however, in section 75, there in the Kefrea manuscript, it goes, and I think it's in Melitius against Peter, man of the Lord. In this manuscript, it sorry, I'm just double checking. Yeah, in the same way, Melitius over Peter, man of the Lord. In this case, the letter has been edited in so that that line goes in the same way, Melitius over Peter, man of the Lord, and over Alexander. And then we have the letter integrated there. So it's clearly the Ethiopic scribe at some point in the tradition, because I do strongly believe that this as I said, cannot belong to that same section that has been published by you and Bausi. But within the Ethiopic context, within the stream of the Ethiopic transmission, it has been integrated deliberately, quite deliberately, into this by the scribe. So there is a tangible connection there. And with the excision of the episcopal list, we have the same sort of light editing around the edges to sort of make it properly fit together. I'll just comment on the Tiberius issue and the bishop from Thumis installed by Peter. For the purposes of time, I didn't get into this, but it is very notable, I think, that in the the list of Nicene bishops, in the Coptic version, Tiberius is assigned to Thumis. And so, this is different from the Greek version.
Yes,
and other versions which give, different locations. If we take the Coptic version then as original, and we postulate in the potentially there is a corruption in the Euromascal manuscript that Tibernos is actually Tiberius or something like that. We could basically wind up, I want to say, conflating all of these and identifying them as the same individual. I think that is quite a reasonable possibility, but not perhaps 100% certain. But with respect to such an identification, I do find it particularly attractive, because then we aren't essentially creating additional bishops. It is somebody who is known, and moreover that there is a Melitian bishop in that locality at the time of Nicaea.
I only add a little thing that is, when I was young, I wrote an article about the Coptic history of the church, in which there is a strange section devoted to Melitius and Peter. And there it is interesting because first there is the legend that will be elaborated about the dream of Peter, the dream of Peter, and yes, the prediction of the future schisma by Arius. But on the other side, there is also a kind of decree about bishops that are to be accepted or not. That could be or a kind of allusion to the famous letter of the Council of Nicaea to the Alexandrian Church, or this was my hypothesis. The rest of, but I was young there. The rest of a decree of the council organized by Peter of Alexandria, because it is clear also from the letter of Peter that he will meet high ranked persons, and I think that they could be the bishops or a group of bishops of the Alexandrian Church to take a decision about Melitius and the followers, because the problem is different. No, followers that who could be originally bishops belonging to the Catholic Church. So there could be documentation about this gathering, this kind of synod by Peter. And probably if the letter is authentic, the reference to Acts, to something written could be also to this council and its written Acts. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto and Bert, for this exchange. There is some more time for further questions. And there is a question from Beriket in the chat, a double question. Beriket, would you like to elaborate in person? Or else I can read your question.
Yeah.
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, thank you, TeTra, for your presentation. Yeah, I have two questions. The first is the letter of, as you know, the letter of Constantine to King Ezana didn't survive in this, but the same, letter which was written like at the beginning of the Christianity in Ethiopia, which you present today, has survived in this. What do you think is the reason? Is it because it speaks in favor of the church and the former is against the church, or do we have other hypotheses? And second is, what is the background history of the translation of this manuscript? Was it a copy of copies from the Aksumite Empire, or was it translated during the medieval time? And if it is in the medieval time, or if it was surviving among the monasteries of Ethiopia, is there any source where the great theologian Georgios of Sagla has mentioned it, or any mention by the local sources?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for both of those questions. With regard to the letter from Constantius to Ezana, and this is a letter basically asking that Frumentius be sent to the emperor for investigation. I think the very likely scenario is that that letter never existed in Gaz. So the Roman and the Eastern Roman Greek-speaking world is dominant at that time, and there is no reason to believe that Constantius sending a letter to Axum would imagine that it wouldn't be understandable there. We know that for example, there are Greek-speaking traders in Adulis and other places. I think it's also significant to think about Frumentius himself. If we accept more or less the story as of his arrival and time in Ethiopia as presented by Socrates Scholasticus, we're sort of faced to reckon with the the notion of why did Ezana or the ruling family find Frumentius useful to them? Is it because he's not Ethiopian, or is it because he is trained in Greek education and that is a major element and aspect of how the Aksumite Empire is being administered? And of course, we have a great many bilingual inscriptions showing that Greek was a fairly active part. Of course, also on the coins many of them have Greek legends. So all of this, suggests to me that, Greek was, so common that, there's no reason for this particular letter to ever be translated into Ge'ez. And I would also side with Monroe Hay, who has argued, I think, quite well that there is no evidence for Ethiopian, or I want to say Ge'ez translations until well into, at least well into the 5th century. And, by that point, is the letter of Constantius, even if there is a copy of it, is it useful to the church or, useful to translate? Probably not. So the history of the translation of this letter into Ge'ez, I would, suggest that, if this derives from the Jubilee Book of 368, that, certain copies were made in the latter part of the 4th century, certain Greek copies were made in the latter part of the 4th century. And, the Aksumite kingdom being sort of one of the more important areas under control of the See of Alexandria, may have sent a Greek copy for their, sort of to shore up their authority in the Aksumite realm. I would suggest that it is, sort of in relation to the last question, probably not translated until the late 5th or maybe early 6th century into Ge'ez, but it is certainly translated from Greek, and in my opinion, certainly part of the same translation as the History of Episcopate of Alexandria. And from there, through various vicissitudes, it has been copied and passed down until it, till it reaches this manuscript from circa 1400. I don't think there's, significant evidence that there are major deliberate changes to the contents of the text. And as for whether it, may have been known or mentioned to theologians like Georgius of Sagala, of course, there's a possibility. I haven't found any direct evidence for it yet. It is arguably probably a somewhat arcane topic, but that certainly can't be precluded.
For the next 2 questions, I'd like to give the floor first to Alessandro Bausi and then to Aaron Butts. Please.
Thank you very much, Ted. Of course, congratulations for this wonderful presentation and discovery. And as you can imagine, I am interested in knowing if you had the occasion of comparing the text of the History of the Episcopate of Alexandria as published by Alberto Campani and myself, and to see if there is any kind of major difference, and if actually the new manuscript you have mentioned and studied actually contains the entirety of what has already been published, and if there is any kind of major features which distinguish the two of them. So this is my main question. Thank you.
Yes, I have made a preliminary comparison of the full text. It contains more or less everything found in the Euro-Maskell manuscript, except for your sections 18, 21, 24, and then I think it's 76 to 85. It doesn't contain those, but it contains all of the other sections. There is, as well as I say, the missing section between, I think, leaves 5 and 6 of the Kefreta manuscript. It also includes that material. As for differences, there is certainly a little bit of editing around the peripheries of these missing sections, as I say, also editing at the end where the Epistula ad Tiberium has been inserted. The rest of it, I don't see any clear evidence for deliberate editing. Of course, there are the variations we find in Ethiopic texts, and but for the most part, I think of your conjectures in the edition and otherwise, I think about 60% are confirmed, and and in other cases that certainly this manuscript is inferior. I think there are, however, a number of cases, particularly towards the beginning, where it gives the better renderings of, say, the names of the bishops in the letter to the letter of the four bishops to Melitius. It also, in the earlier sections, there are some places, I think, where the Euromescal manuscript basically creates a nonsensical ordering. This manuscript, the ordering is what we would expect. But there are, apart from the missing section, there isn't really any highly significant differences.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for the next question, Arian, please.
Yeah, mine was a bit of a follow-up on the exchange with Bereket, and I think there's much that could be said about Frumentius in this, but maybe I pause it, but I just wanted to say something about this letter of Constantius to Izana. Of course, this is like a very different type of letter, and I mean, maybe Alberto or someone could say more, but there's a lot of historical questions about it. That is, it's transmitted in a polemical document, right? It's not Athanasius's letter at all. It's Athanasius's writing, presenting a letter by Constantius, and I historically, and all sorts of questions come up about really how to understand this letter. Is it even a letter? What exactly is it? So I would just, pause and put it in a slightly different category than what you're proposing with this Athanasius letter that you presented. So just to comment on that, I mean, letter embedded in a polemical document by someone else is really something of a different order, perhaps. Yeah, okay, that's it, just a comment.
We would have time for one or two final brief questions, if anyone feels inspired. I believe Dan Matovic, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. My question is the ignorant question and a more general one. Do we get in Ethiopic epistolary corpora in any sense? So either as a group of letters attributed to one author copied together, or as a collection of letters from different authors in the same manuscripts? Or are there mostly letters preserved in different types of collections, sort of by chance, as is the case in the paper you gave us today? Thank you.
I can't think offhand of any real cases where there are I want to say deliberate collections. I mean, there are two letters, I think, together in the Sologia of Timothy Olurus that are, basically always transmitted together, but that's sort of as part of, I would describe it as a larger textual unit. And I think, there are some other manuscripts where we do get, one or two letters together, but nothing that I would call like a deliberate corpus. And in those cases, at least to my recollection, they're generally attributed to different authors. So there isn't this sort of collecting of authors, but in terms of that, like, trying to collect a particular author's corpus, we don't really have this phenomenon in Ethiopic. So for example, with, Jacob of Sarug, for instance, certain homilies belong to certain homiliaries. There is no evidence that anyone, decided to put together well, here are the homilies of Jacob of Saruk. I mean, we have this in Arabic, we have this in Syriac, but we don't have this same sort of phenomenon in Ethiopic, because it seems that the tradition was, by and large, to copy manuscripts from beginning to end. And so, if you copied a homiliary with, different, with the materials from different authors, you copied that from beginning to end. You don't rearrange it or excerpt material from it.
And we
Thank
might have
you.
time for a very brief closing question. Please, Alessandro Bausi.
Okay, thank you. But I take this wonderful opportunity for addressing Ted also one more question. You stressed the fact that the insertion of the letter was due to an Ethiopic action. Let's say a scribe did this, and of course you have said something concerning the reasons, the grounds for this assumption. But could you say a bit more? Because I think this is extremely interesting. So it, to some extent, configures a kind of activity which, as you have already said right now, is quite uncommon. So this sort of deliberate compilation, picking up from different sources, different documents. So would you like to say something more on this? And yes, the context, the reasons, and the consequence also for the appreciation of the document. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this very important question. This is, in fact, one of the, from the Ethiopic perspective, this is one of the most curious aspects of this this letter and this new witness to the history of Epistula of Alexandria, that there is this very, very clear evidence of deliberate editing, which by and large we don't find with other texts. So, again, when the the lists of appointments of Peter and his predecessors, of the lists of bishops are removed, the context around them needs to be adjusted slightly, otherwise the narrative doesn't flow. And this has been done relatively adroitly. And then the integration of the Epistula ad Tiberium at the end, it doesn't flow naturally narratively. And if the text had closely adhered to the I want to say earlier Urim-Maskell manuscript, you end with Peter, and Melitius over Peter, man of the Lord. You have no real way of suddenly introducing a letter of Alexander in a different context. But by adding and over Alexander, which works very, not terribly in the context, the letter is then, quite clearly and quite deliberately appended onto this, other body of material. Now, when this happened and the reasons why this happened, I really have no idea. I don't see sort of any clear evidence that it occurs in this particular manuscript. But, is this perhaps a sign that, in antiquity, when Ge'ez was a living language, that there was more editorial activity with texts? Perhaps that might be an explanation. Of course, as we know, in the surviving manuscript corpus from when Ge'ez is like Latin and no longer a living language, the textual witnesses are relatively stable and free of this kind of deliberate interference.
And on this note, I'd like to thank our speaker for this excellent talk and also everyone who engaged in the very lively discussion session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. See you next time.
See you next
Good
time.
to see everyone. See you.
Thank you.